Hi, guys. I wanted to start this series with just a kind of 101 defining introduction to what a hybrid school is and how it's different than a microschool. And I'm going to also define that so that I can use the terms and people understand what I am talking about. Now, hybrid school and microschool, especially microschool, seem to be more broad terms. Microschool is being applied even by the National Microschooling Center to any number of different types of programs, different sizes, online, hybrid, and as in some things are taken at school, some things are taken at home or maybe online, 50 kids, 10 kids. There's not really a definition of microschool. But for my purposes, because I want to kind of refine the definition for hybrid school, because it is a particular business model that is different than a microschool when it is larger. It can't just be run out of your home. There's levels of like administration and teachers. There's usually budgetary things and legal things that can be a little bit of different. There's a lot of overlap, but there's some things that are different. So I'm going to define a microschool as small programs that are probably less than 25 kids, that are run by less than 3 staff, and that are very often private businesses. They don't have to be. A lot of them are nonprofits, and that's the same for a hybrid school. But a lot of them are like LLCs. They can be run out of homes, like on private property. That often is the case. So and another piece of that is that microschools are often, and I'm putting myself out there to say this, but they seem to often be offering more like 4 or 5 days a week of schooling, as in almost the entire school experience, like just a school, but small. And they're partnering less in the teaching aspect with the parents, as far as what the parents are doing at home is they probably are still doing stuff at home and supporting the students, but it's not like a significant number of the required days are being delivered at home. Okay, so now that I've kind of defined my definition of microschool, and by the way, those are often I don't want to say they're easy to start, but they can be simpler to start because they can be private businesses with one person. Often they begin in home with just, with 3, 4, 5, 6 kids. So the kind of the startup of like finding a space and hiring people is different. So saying that, I'm going to then talk about how I would define a hybrid school. I define a hybrid school as one that shares a significant amount of the instruction with the parent. I would say half or more of the school days are being delivered by the parent. They are very often homeschool kids, as far as however the state defines homeschooling for wherever the program is. They are very often homeschool kids who are getting a school experience by attending a hybrid school that delivers fewer than half of the days. Now, again, this is my disclaimer. This is my own definition of this based on other hybrid school leaders that I have talked to, people that I looked at, the one that I co-founded, and opposing that to the many conversations that I see about microschools. So in this like educational model, there's often like graded classrooms, just like a school would be. That doesn't have to be the case, but for ease of talking about it, I'm going to pretend that is the case, where you might have a kindergarten through 6th grade, or you might start smaller, but your plan is to grow into like a full elementary school. And there's teachers for each group of kids, and there's usually has to be administration, just like in any school. And when you're very small, like a microschool, a lot of times the founder can be the teacher and the administrator. They're taking care of the paperwork, they're taking care of the admissions, they're taking care of the website, they're taking care of all of the tuition payments, and they're teaching the kids because they can do that. It's a full-time job essentially, but they can do that. Once you get to multiple teachers and you're talking about tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue, you usually need those levels of like administrative tasks, people that have to run the program as well as then the teachers and the aides that are actually like delivering the instruction to the kids. So to sum that up, a hybrid school looks almost exactly like a private school. It's just meeting half or fewer days of the required, 180 days that kids have to go to school, right, in most states. And it is usually larger. I would say at least 50 kids, often 100 or 200 kids, and usually has some of those levels that you traditionally think of in like a traditional school because of the size of it. Okay. So that is the difference between a hybrid school and a microschool, the way I am defining it. Now, both types of schools can be either a nonprofit or an LLC. A nonprofit is run by a board legally. They're responsible for the compliance. They're responsible for, the like sustainability of the program as far as like making sure that things are planned for, the budget is solid, there's financial transparency. Sometimes they're responsible for fundraising and writing for grants, although a lot of school models are just tuition funded. So they may or may not be applying for a lot of grants and doing a lot of fundraising in a nonprofit. But that's one of the advantages of a nonprofit is that you can apply for grants, you can fundraise, people can make tax deductible donations. You can even use volunteers as like labor. You can't do that with a private business. You can use parents as aides or whatever, if that's how you would like to do that to keep the costs down. Nonprofits can do that. Another probably big reason why some businesses, both microschools and hybrid schools, start as nonprofits is that if they are using a church space as their building facility, there can be tax issues. And I'm not an accountant, disclaimer, I'm not an accountant, but there can be tax issues for the church if they rent to a private business, a for-profit business. But if they rent or donate a space to a nonprofit, they don't have to deal with those tax issues usually. So sometimes a hybrid school or I suppose a larger microschool or even a smaller one will go to a church and ask to use their space because they usually have empty classrooms that aren't being used during the week in larger buildings and the facilities to deal with a lot of people, but a lot of people aren't usually in the buildings during the week. So they're just kind of a perfect setup. But because they are churches, some businesses are like, well, I like it. It's going to scratch all the churches off the list for building possibilities if I become an LLC. So I might need to become a nonprofit for that reason. Okay. So that's one of the reasons. Now, they're also a lot harder to start as far as like not the initial paperwork. That's just as easy, really. But to actually become a nonprofit is harder because it's a full form that has to go to the IRS and get approved. And then it's like specific tax form that needs to be done every year. And there's like the bylaws and the board that have to be doing their job throughout the year. So it's certainly a much more complex structure. Now, an LLC is far simpler in the sense that you just fill out that paperwork as an LLC with your state and get your EIN from the IRS with all these letters. It's employer identification number from the Internal Revenue Service. And you own your own business. Like it's just your business. You should open a bank account separately. And then all the taxes are taxed through your personal income. Okay, there's no board, there's no bylaws. You don't take donations. It's your business. You profit, you risk, you reward. It's all yours. Okay. Both of those models can be applied to both hybrid schools and microschools as far as the business model. I find in my exposure to this that very often hybrid schools end up becoming nonprofits because of the size and the facilities. They often do start in churches. Not always, but they often start in churches. They often stay in churches, although some that have been around for a long time may be able to lease their own property or, even build their own property. But of course, if you're running a 2 or 3 day a week program, you almost certainly cannot just own a commercial property or rent a commercial property with a part-time program. So usually you have to have multiple types of programs. So you're actually having revenue from like full-time use of the building to actually afford that. So for that reason, if a hybrid school is starting with maybe 2 or 3 days a week, it's kind of off the table to have a full-time building arrangement unless they start off with multiple programs. it's just very difficult to do. So oftentimes they start with a church, which means they start as a nonprofit and usually stay a nonprofit. Microschools, because they start so small often, and sometimes they do use church, but they can also often use community centers, or, they can rent a room more easily, or even a library space or an outdoor space, or, or just start in someone's home because they plan on staying small often, like 6 to 12 kids. They don't need to worry about the building aspect of it, like having large building with lots and lots of classrooms and bathrooms and all of that at the size to serve 50 or 100 or 150 kids at a time. Okay, so it often makes more sense. And they're often run just by that one person who started it. They can kind of do all of it as their own business, just like any business owner would. So it seems that a lot of them just start as LLCs. Now, again, this is not a rule by any stretch of the imagination. As I said, both types of business models can be applied to both hybrid and microschools. But from what I have seen, often the hybrid schools become nonprofits and the microschools often become LLCs, although I have seen a lot of them that are nonprofits. Okay, so when I talk about hybrid school in upcoming videos, I'm talking about a larger program with administration and teachers and the need for kind of scaling as far as admissions and budgets and money and student information and some of the legal stuff, safety stuff, and all of that is going to apply to any size program. But the channels through who handles it and who approves it is just a little more complex with a hybrid school. That's the model I'm describing. If that sounds interesting to you as possibly an entrepreneur or a teacher who wishes you could just, start your own business and leave your job or whatever, I also will talk in a future video about what that can look like for you as a job. Now, if you're already thinking, well, how can I can't replace my full-time income with a part-time program? That's probably true. But something that I think entrepreneurs should think about is starting a hybrid program that runs multiple programs. So it's a hybrid for the people who are coming to it, but you might be running a 2-day program and a 3-day program for different sets of kids, or maybe 2 2-day programs and an enrichment day or something like that. So essentially you could run it. For you, it's a full-time job, but for your students, it's still a hybrid program. So something to think about. So I will talk about that in the upcoming videos. Hopefully that helped you understand the difference between a hybrid program and a microschool, the way that I'm defining it. And hopefully you are thinking a little bit about this model as a possibility for a business or a career change as an entrepreneur. So I will see you in the next one.